Welcome back to America's Founding, Up Close and Personal. Today's lesson, the Declaration and Constitution. 2 documents, 1 voice. Now, we've looked a little bit at the Declaration already in a thorough reading, but I want to highlight some additional items as we look at these 2 documents and their 1 voice. The biblical ideas of the Declaration of Independence are profound. As we look at the document, we can see the names of God repeated 4 times in the document. The laws of nature and of nature's God, the Creator, the Supreme Judge of the world, and then lastly, divine providence. As we look at these things, we begin to realize once again that our rights, in fact, come from God. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So our rights come from the Creator God. Second, as this concept is developed in the Declaration, we find that the government's primary purpose is to protect those rights, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We also see that the citizens have a right in this process, and that is to abolish governments that don't protect their God-given rights. The Declaration clearly states that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. These 3 key ideas, the rights given to us by our Creator, that the government's role is to protect those rights, and that a citizen's charge or even right is to reinstitute governments so that those Creator-given rights are protected. Well, let's take a look at this last theme of God in the Declaration, divine providence. This superintending purpose that God had at the inception of the United States of America. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The father of our country, George Washington, said this: "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency." The superintending hand of God in the formation and the principles buried in the Declaration. In fact, if you were to take some time and reflect on the Declaration and read it through a time or 2 or a 3rd time, you'd see these themes coming to the surface. These biblical concepts that God has established universal and unchanging truths, that God created people in His image, that God gives humankind dignity and freedoms, that God gives rights, not governments, that God values human life, that God values liberty and freedom of conscience, that God made people to enjoy life and pursue their dreams, that God is the ultimate authority in the world, that government and political leaders will be judged for their actions while in office and held accountable, and that God is trustworthy, that God is active in world events, and that people can live for something greater than themselves. All of these biblical themes are saturated in this originating document, this birth certificate of the United States. This is why at the center of it all is the idea of our Creator. And as a nation, we need to pause and ask this question of ourselves. Are we for the Creator, or are we at war with the Creator? Are we leaning into God's principles as a nation and what He has intended for our country? Or are we at war with the Creator? This is also an individual question for us. Are we for the Creator, or are we at war with the Creator? It's something for us all to consider as we go through this curriculum. The fact is, the Declaration has universal truths that are true for all people at all times. It's unique in all the world. There's no other country in the world that has a document that is a statement of unchanging principles that are true for all people at all times, in all places, everywhere. The Charter of Liberties, this Charter of Liberties, as outlined in the Declaration, are held up around the world. It's the greatest gift of the United States to the world. There's a reason that it's read and studied and held up in countries where individuals are working for their freedom and seeking their freedom, oftentimes represented by the Statue of Liberty. Over the years, we've seen different countries experiencing tyranny, and often in the crowds, you'll find Statue of Liberties and copies of the Declaration of Independence held up. That's why the Statue of Liberty is so well known around the world. Liberty to the world. The Statue of Liberty was dedicated in 1876, and on that 100-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, we find the uniqueness of the Statue of Liberty is, in fact, she's holding a copy of the Declaration in her hands. The date is July 4th, 1776. This is the Declaration, not the Constitution. It's the holding of the Declaration as she promotes liberty to humankind. It's also notable that in the base of the Statue of Liberty, there's a hollowed out stone that contains a copy of the Declaration of Independence. She's standing on the Declaration. So she's holding it, she's standing on it, and then notably, many people don't realize this, but the Statue of Liberty's real name is Liberty Enlightening the World. Well, to enlighten is to give intellectual or spiritual light. It's also to instruct and to impart knowledge, to illuminate. And she's giving this to the world. You know, many people don't realize that the Statue of Liberty is not just standing there stoic, inviting people in. She is a mobile woman. Her back heel is lifted, and you can see it in this image. She is actually moving out these principles of liberty that can be applied to any nation in the world that embraces them as their own. And this is why so many people around the world rejoice in the Declaration of Independence and the Statue of Liberty. The Liberty Bell and the Declaration of Independence ring forth these truths. Proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. So, as we've kind of overviewed the Declaration of Independence again together, let's take a look now at how the Constitution and the Declaration fit hand in glove. Let me divert for a minute and talk about the concept of charters and bylaws. A charter is a document that's issued by a king or a legislature or another authority defining the entity's principles, beliefs, and purposes. Bylaws, on the other hand, are a set of rules that are adopted by an organization on how they're going to govern themselves, how their members are going to organize their affairs. We see this in modern business. A charter is why a company goes into business. A set of bylaws is how a company will organize and govern itself. Well, in the United States of America experience, our Declaration of Independence serves as our nation's charter, our purpose document. And the U.S. Constitution serves as our bylaws, our organizational document, how we're going to organize ourselves. So as we look at the Constitution in this series, we need to realize that the Constitution is designed to serve the principles of the Declaration. So when we read these universal truths in the Declaration, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men were created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with these rights, these in fact are universal truths that the Constitution is designed to protect. Another illustration that I find helpful so I can grasp this in my mind is human anatomy. Of course, a human being needs both a heart and a rib cage, among other things, but if we use this analogy and this analogy alone, we see that the Declaration serves as the life or the heart of our country. It gives the life. And the rib cage in this example would be the Constitution, as it serves the Declaration by protecting it. So these two things work together hand in hand. It's unique that these two ideas were even ideas that Abraham Lincoln embraced in yet a third way. And these were his words. This fragment I'm about to quote was found some number of years later after his presidency, and it was never really produced in any of his written work, but it was a short handwritten fragment found among Lincoln's presidential papers. It's believed that it was written in 1861, shortly after he had taken office, and it was never published, as I said, in a formal setting. The first paragraph of this fragment says this, and he's talking about the Declaration and Constitution, and here are these themes, and I'll summarize for us at the end. All this is not a result of an accident. It has a philosophical cause. Without the Constitution and the Union, we could not have attained the result. But even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There's something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty for all. The principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, an enterprise and industry to all. The second paragraph. This expression of that principle in our Declaration of Independence was a most happy and fortunate thing. Without this, as well with it, we could have declared our independence of Great Britain. But without it, we could not. I think we could not have ever secured the free government and consequent prosperity. No oppressed people will fight and endure as our fathers did without the promise of something better than a mere changing of masters. He continues in the third paragraph. The assertion that the principle at the time was a word fitly spoken, which is proved as an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. And he closes with these remarks. So let us act with neither picture or apple shall ever be blurred or broken. That we may so act, we must study and understand the points of danger. And so what he was saying in all of this was actually a reference to a Bible passage. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a picture of silver. Now, how would we put this in modern language? Here's how I would summarize Abraham Lincoln's full quote. The Constitution is a frame of silver adorning and preserving the Declaration of Independence, which is the apple of gold. So these two things, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, fit hand in glove together. And as we consider these documents again, two documents but one voice, let's dwell now a few minutes on the Constitution and its meaning in this hand-in-glove relationship. You see, the U.S. Constitution is a glorious liberty document. The mind and influence of Frederick Douglass is one that profoundly impacted my own understanding on the glories of this document. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery on Maryland's eastern shore. He escaped when he was 20 years old. He became one of the greatest abolitionists and orators of the 1800s. But initially, he was a huge critic of the Constitution. He called it a covenant with death. But because he was a man of high intellectual integrity, he continued to read and to think. He studied the founders, their legal theory, history, and he had a conversion. He had a dramatic conversion to the Constitution. He told others that this was not a hasty decision, but it was done through careful and thoughtful study. He said this, with great resolve, he concluded, the U.S. Constitution was both the founding generation's greatest achievement and the abolitionist's greatest weapon. Take the Constitution according to its plain meaning, he said, and I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. Interpret it as it ought to be interpreted, and the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. Did you catch that? A glorious liberty document. So back to our theme of the Declaration and the Constitution being hand in hand, protecting one another and uplifting one another. Frederick Douglass later said this, and I feel like this is a closing idea as we wrap up this lesson, that he had one great political idea, and it was this. I have one great political idea, he said. That idea is an old one. It's widely and generally assented to, but nevertheless, it's very generally trampled upon and disregarded. This constitutes my politics, he said, the negative and positive of my politics, and the whole of my politics. I feel it's my duty to do all my power to infuse this idea into the public mind, that it may speedily be recognized and practiced upon by our people. The best expression of it I have is found in the Bible, and in its substance, it is this: righteousness exalts a nation, sin is a reproach to any people. Well, Douglass had this in his mind, and he quoted Proverbs 14:34, and it's interesting to know that our founding father, George Washington, echoed Frederick Douglass's theme. The propitious smiles of heaven, Washington said, can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained, that righteousness exalts a nation and sin is a reproach to any people. Benjamin Franklin said this, "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain who build it, that without his concurring aid, we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages." The Declaration of Independence, our charter and purpose document, our U.S. Constitution, our bylaws, and our organizational document. Together, the Constitution serves the principles of the Declaration. The Declaration gives life, the Constitution protects that life. And it's a charter of liberties that are held up around the world. You see, America's manifest destiny is in reality putting into practice the principles of liberty and sharing them with the world. Thank you for this lesson. My name is Craig Seibert. I am the director of ChristianCitizenshipTraining.org, and thank you for being with us today.